to meet you.
Good afternoon and welcome. It's good to see everyone here at the Wilson Center. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct our programs at the Center on Global Sustainability and Resilience. And when we look at questions around youth and peace building, we see this as a very central component to resiliency and resilience building at various levels. I know many of you are familiar with the Wilson Center. We focus on analysis and policy engagement and innovative program interventions. And we do this in collaboration with on very salient topics with very prominent partners such as UNFPA. So we're very pleased to be able to welcome you to this afternoon's discussion on shifting paradigms, the role of young people in building peace and security. Young people, peace and security. And I think when you think of these issues, they bring a lot of connections, perceptions, questions, and opportunities. And this is exactly what we want to talk about today. My boss, the president and CEO and director of the Wilson Center, often describes us as an intellectual candy shop. So we're exploring a whole range of issues that are very salient, that are very current, where you don't get fat on spin. So there isn't the spin. We're getting at the evidence, getting to the heart of the issues, and looking at why they're important today. So earlier in the day, a few of us were looking at some of the key issues around the opportunity that the new UN resolution provides for us. As many of you know, in 2015, the UN Secretary Council adopted Resolution 2050, which marked the emergence of youth, peace, and security coming together on that agenda. And as we thought about this, we talked a little bit earlier today about recognizing what it means as we look at the demographic dividend. We talked about youth bulges and how do we understand and perceive this issue and the degree to which this can be looked at, examined, and worked on as a peace dividend. We see this as a really important opportunity. As we talked a little bit about that, we really recognize that in many cases that youth are excluded from the agenda. So this is a huge opportunity to ensure that we work towards youth inclusion in a very positive way. We had many youth working with us earlier in the day who are very actively involved in a very progressive way, and we wanted to recognize that the very positive contributions that youth are making. At the same time, we wanted to challenge ourselves and deconstruct this notion of youth. By youth, do we mean very often, when we say youth, are people hearing or reacting to young men and young men coming from the elite? And having those young men coming from the elite present in this peace-building circle, is that what we're talking about? How do we get to the young women who are being missed? What are the opportunities around that? So we wanted to think of what that means in terms of recognizing the role of young people as political actors. And this is a huge opportunity for us as we look at the resolution. And then ultimately, we have this opportunity with the resolution. How do we make the resolution real? So this is a little bit of the context and the dialogue that we have been having this morning, and we wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to work with UNFPA and other colleagues to bring this to the forefront and to have an opportunity to have an exchange with you. So as we look at the resolution, we wanted to have a sense of how can we engage policymakers. How did we get to having this resolution now? Why is it important now? What is the opportunity space? Where are the obstacles? And what does it mean moving forward? So these are some of the key framing questions that we want to have a look at on this panel this afternoon. So I am thrilled to be here with the colleagues that we have with us, and we will be hearing from each one of them. But I'm going to actually start with Andy. So Andy Rabens serves as the political advisor for global youth issues at the U.S. Department of State in the Office of the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. In that role, he focuses on helping the U.S. government better engage young people internationally to help solve the pressing challenges today while looking at opportunities for greater global connectivity and networks that lead to a more secure and prosperous future, a more secure and prosperous future. So he's the principal representative on youth issues at the U.S. Department of State, leading these efforts. So Andy, as we take a moment to pause and say, wow, this is a huge development. Could you tell us a little bit about how we got here? How did we get to the point of having this resolution, and how are you thinking about it? What are the opportunities that it presents from your perspective?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you, Roger Mark and Wilson Center, for putting this together. And I just want to make a note that it's really thrilling to begin the microphone. Well, I just wanted to thank Roger Mark and the Wilson Center for putting this today together and convening everyone. And I also wanted to make a note that it's really thrilling to be up here with three dynamic and leading female voices, particularly in this particular space. What I thought, and I want to thank you guys all for coming out, bearing the Washington, D.C. traffic and being with us today, because I know a lot of you have been working both as advocates and activists in this youth space. What I was hoping to touch on for Roger Mark's question is just give a little context of what UN Security Council Resolution 2250 is all about and where it came from, because there's a really nice story behind it. Then I thought I'd just touch very briefly on a few of the big challenges that we have going forward post 2250, and then just close very briefly with a couple thoughts about where we can go from here. So does that sound okay?
Perfect.
All right, perfect. So UN Security Council 2250. I think many folks in this room, just raise your hand real quick if you've had a hand in terms of lobbying for it, working around it. I know many folks here have actually played a concrete role in making this happen. But I think it's a testament to the fact that global youth today can have a real meaningful impact on the big issues of the day in the big arenas where discussions are happening, chiefly the UN Security Council. The resolution, as many folks know, is really the hard work of young people, of activists, of advocates, of NGO communities, of governments. And I think the story the resolution itself has really changed the narrative of young people, where if we think back to maybe 2 years ago, many governments saw young people through a lens of fear and insecurity. They understood the increasing numbers of youth, and that technology at young people's fingertips was changing the way that people communicated. But I think there was still a narrative of youth as drivers of conflict and creators of instability as opposed to partners of peace. And if we move back to April 2015, where I start the story of Resolution 2250, the Crown Prince of Jordan, Crown Prince Hussein, convened a Security Council session at the age of 20 on the role of youth in countering violent extremism and promoting peace. You then move to August 2015, and global youth leaders from around the world gathered in Amman, Jordan, at the invitation of the government of Jordan, the United Nations, and a number of partners to really wrestle with these challenges of youth and peace building and extremism, and came up with the Amman Declaration on Youth, Peace, and Security. We then fast forward to September 2015 on the periphery of the UN General Assembly in 2015, and the US government hosted the Global Youth Summit Against Violent Extremism, which reconvened a number of youth leaders, advocates, activists, NGO communities to touch on the Amman Declaration and to craft a youth action agenda, which talked even further about ways that youth and governments could work together in collaboration. You then fast forward to this period of September to December 2015, where youth, NGOs, governments all came together work to draft a resolution and then to push that resolution through governments, through advocacy avenues, and to actually get by December 9th of 2015, UN Security Council Resolution 2250 at the Security Council, when the U.S. was president for that month, the Jordanians put the resolution forward. It was unanimously voted on and adopted. And here we are today, or here we were back in 2015 with a final, the first ever UN Security Council resolution on youth, peace, and security, which was an achievement in its own right. And I think it does three things. It helps to harden the narrative of youth as partners for peace as opposed to drivers of conflict. It acknowledges that governments need to work with young people in youth organizations to be able to achieve wins in the peace-building space. And it also gives a boost to youth efforts to build a more peaceful, just, inclusive community. And also to ensure that not just men, but young women are at the table in the peace-building process. I know you'll hear more about that in a few minutes. But the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 is a great first step. But at the end of the day, it's ink on paper. It's something that I think we can all hold up and be proud of, but it's ink on paper. And I think the task before us now and the task over the past year and going forward is how do you turn that ink into action? How do you actually make it come alive? And three of the challenges I think we still face regarding this effort is one, the fact that youth voices who are advocating for peace, who are working in the peace-building space, and who are pushing back against extremism are still far too seldom getting heard. We know for a fact that many people are moved by peers, and that friends are the ones who can really persuade people to actually join the movement or to push away or push down a more positive pathway. And we also recognize that governments often are not the most credible voice in the room. So we certainly need to do more to raise the voices, shine the spotlights on young people who are really advocating in this space. People like Allah, who you're going to hear from in a moment, who at the age of 21 started a Voice of Libyan Women and has been working in the women's empowerment space to get women at the table in peace building in Libya and around the globe. And there are countless other stories of young people whose story needs to be told both to inspire others and to show that we're united as a global youth community in peace building and pushing back against extremism. The State Department back in April of this past year launched the Emerging Young Leaders Award, which raised up 10 profiles from around the globe of young people who are really active in this peace-building space and countering extremism. Secondly, I think young people today are still being targeted as potential recruits by groups like ISIL and other extremist elements. They're, because of challenging global times, war, ongoing civil war in Syria, tough economic times. We just saw a report recently about youth employment rates even increasing. There are a number of push and pull factors that are very real that folks are preying on disenfranchised youth and local grievances by offering senses of adventure, of dignity, of economic opportunity, and we collectively have to be able to push back against that in a more muscular, meaningful way. I think often about, I don't know if folks remember back in 2014, ISIL had a series of tweets, a campaign around their new pancake recipe. And it's kind of an interesting metaphor because they were trying to make the case 3.5 years into a serious civil war, and when it was a challenging time economically for a lot of people, they're going out with these tweets about this new pancake recipe and this picture of a stack of fluffy pancakes with syrup dripping down, and trying to appeal to young people that if you come join ISIL, this will be your daily breakfast when you have young people who are starving, and that kind of this is what life will be like if you're willing to join us. And from a metaphorical standpoint, I think that prompts us to two things. One, that we have to offer a better alternative to pancakes. As good as that looks, maybe it's waffles, maybe it's French toast, maybe it's crepes. We have to offer a better deal to young people. And two, we have to make the case that the big, fluffy stack of pancakes with syrup dripping down, when you bite into those pancakes, they're not going to taste as good as they look. And the fact that young people are not getting into what they may appear to be sold on. The third big issue, I think, is this lack of creative partnerships between governments and young people, and also youth-led NGOs and the private sector. And I think we need to get creative as a community to build upon UN Security Council Resolution 2250 to find better partnerships that are creative and that inspire more movements and action in the peace-building space. I think we can learn a lot from UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security that was adopted back in 2000, and the movement among what that sparked in terms of new partnerships in the women's empowerment space and ensuring the women were at the political table and the peace-building table. And I just want to also note that one of the efforts that we launched a couple weeks ago on the periphery of UN General Assembly this year was a partnership between the State Department, with Facebook, with EdVentures. It was a peer-to-peer combating extremism program that we're expanding for high schools around the globe to try to allow them to spark their own campaigns in the peace-building space and to push back against extremism. So in closing, and then I want to open things up to the other dynamic panelists up here, we've come a long way, I think, in the past couple of years to change that narrative of youth as really drivers of conflict to partners in peace. And I think the task in front of us now is to turn the ink of Resolution 2250 into real, concrete, mobilizing action. So I think we can do that in three ways. As noted before, I think we can double down our efforts to amplify the voices of young people who are leading in this space. I think we can tackle in a more muscular way the push and pull factors that are being utilized by extremist organizations to try to target young people and bring them down more nefarious pathways. And thirdly, I think we can create new creative partnerships and ways to work together between governments, young people, private sector, NGOs, to really figure out how we build upon the opportunity that 2250 has afforded us. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy. So I'm going to ask you a question that we didn't discuss before, so bear with me. So you talk about tackling the push and pull factors in a muscular way. And I know we were talking, I want to ask you about some non-muscular approaches, though.
Okay.
So I know we were talking about this a little bit earlier, and we said, how do we create a space for youth to emerge and really provide leadership, particularly with those of us who are no longer considered youth? So forgive me, I may put you in that category. And one of the things that we talked about was the importance of reverse mentoring. And I wonder, as you think about your work in this space, whether you might have a personal story that you can tell where you have seen a youth leader in action that has helped mentor you. How have you personally, as someone who's a leader in this space, how have you learned from the youth leaders that are engaging you?
Sure.
Is that a fair question?
That's a great question. I think reverse mentoring happens all the time. I think when we're open to it. And when we take a step back, often some of the young leaders who I think I'm mentoring when I take a step back and think about things, I'm actually often being mentored by them in real ways. And I think that, to give an example, at the last couple of weeks, we've had a U.S. youth observer to the United Nations, a girl, Nicole Perez, who is only, I think, about just barely out of college at about 22 years old. And I thought that I was mentoring her about how to mobilize young people and how to build a movement. And pretty quickly, the fluency, she works Instagram, the fluency of tools at her fingertips, the network that she has, the avenues into campuses, not only in the United States, but because of social media platforms around the globe, pretty quickly I realized that she was teaching me a whole heck of a lot about how you could actually reach people in corners that the governments don't often always have tentacles in. So I think that's one very small case. I think when I get the chance to travel overseas, there was a girl who a lot of folks who I get the chance to still stay in contact with out in Clichy-sous-Bois. I don't know if anybody's been out to Paris, but outside of the periphery of Paris, you have the suburbs called the banlieues. And back in 2005, Clichy-sous-Bois was one of the places where a lot of the social justice protests had started in Paris. And spending a day with a girl, Nadira, out there who's both Muslim and African descent, and actually seeing on the ground the challenges that she faces and the discriminatory practices that are there, both, I think, raised a lot of awareness for me, but also when you kind of look back home and you see what's happening in the United States right now, I think raises a lot of the connectedness of challenges that young people face, not only in the peace-building space, but on some of the push and pull factors that are driving people to be more prone to be picked off by extremist elements. So Countless stories, I think.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Ala, I'd like to come to you next. So, Dr. Ala Murabet is a medical doctor, a United Nations High-Level Commissioner on Health, Employment, and Economic Growth, and one of 17 Global Sustainable Development Goals advocates, and an MIT Media Lab Director's Fellow. And we talked a little bit about your nickname from John Stewart, the Libyan doggy Hauser, or Doogie Hauser. So you said that really apparently resonates with American audiences. And this is part of a recognition of your innovative approach to security. And you continue to act as an advisor to numerous governments, regional bodies, international security boards, think tanks, and organizations. And I think, as Andy alluded to, just when you were 21, you founded the Voice of Libyan Women. So quite impressive. And I wonder whether you could reflect a little bit as you think about where we are now, the opportunity space that we occupy now. How did you as a young woman at age 21 get started in this space? And what is the opportunity to bring young women more into this space now? And how is that playing out for you in Libya?
Thank you. When you read it out, it sounds so much better. So I started my organization, the Voice of Libyan Women, in 2011. I was 21 at the time. And the core focus of the organization in its initial stages was women's political participation and economic empowerment. So we started off with a women's charter project that we took nationally. And I quickly learned, and we had been using a lot of, the UN declarations and conventions and CEDAW and 1325 to really propel conversations. And I very quickly learned and was informed heavily that those were irrelevant in our community because our national laws had not been respected for 41 years. So why were they going to start learning about international law, which couldn't be respected? So we quickly began to reshift our focus, and we did it in two different streams. One stream was very high-level political, and it's actually what gave us enough legitimacy to do the grassroots, and I'll explain this in a second. But I'm 21. I was 21 at the time, not 21 anymore, and I had not been from the capital city. I was from a city called Zawiya, which is about 30 to 45 minutes away, but it is considered much more conservative. And at the time, the UN and the international community really were focused on the two larger cities in Libya. They had not come out to Zawiya. If they did, it would be to meet the local council for a couple of hours. But they definitely weren't meeting with civil society. And when they called on women's groups, we were not considered a women's group. We were young. And so when we talk now about youth, peace, and security, everybody talks about young men who they're worried will pick up guns. And when we talk about women's rights, everybody talks about older women who have influence networks, finances, support. And so young women tend to get left out. So our approach to this was to find them. And so I went to Tripoli and I waited in a hotel lobby that I had seen on the news as being where the UN was based. And I waited, and then I saw a group of older, middle-aged white men, and I was like, "This is them." But it was. So I went and I sat down and I said, "This is our project. This is the work we do, etc." And they were excited about it. And I all the time think about if I had sat down with a different member of that group and they had been somebody who said, "We're not interested right now," if I would be in the positions I am in now and have the role that I was able to play in Libya. And so from there, we did something called One Voice. And it was an international conference. At the time, Catherine Ashton, who was working with the EU, came and spoke. And in our second year, actually, Milan Verveer was our key speaker. And the idea was to be able to bring people who were working on the ground to Tripoli to meet with parliamentarians and the government and to actually sit around tables and solve problems together. So each day was dedicated. It was 5 days. Each day was dedicated to one thing. So one day would be economy. The other day would be religion and social change. And there would be politics. And then there was education and media. And the idea was to show not only the political players, but the other civil society, the ones who tended not to include the younger women, that we could convene them, that we were the ones who could bring everybody together, that we had a very key role to play. And so when it first happened, it was before Tripoli, it was a week and a half after Tripoli was liberated, November 11th of 2011. And the idea genuinely was that when people showed up, none of them knew we were the organization. People thought I worked for whoever headed up our organization. But everybody had been still talking about humanitarian efforts. Everybody had still been talking about conflict. And so we were the ones who really shifted the conversation into politics and policy. And what are we going to push for in our constitution and our women's charter and women's inclusion in the media? And security was obviously one of those key components. And the reason I mention all of this, the reason I give this information is because we often attempt to say, well, we're going to work with only grassroots youth, or we're going to work with only, the elite men who can sit around the table. And there's a key amount of strength in having all of those different voices there. Youth are not monolithic. In fact, youth are exceptionally fluid. I will no longer be youth, as my sisters remind me, in I think 4 years. I think 4 years. So I mean, we're not a static group. And that's often why there hasn't been a lot of inclusion of youth and a lot of movement for youth, because by the time somebody is included, they're past their youth age and they're working on something else. So I think we have to be very realistic about the challenges that exist. If we're going to be very, genuine and organic about the inclusion of youth, we have to be talking about the spaces in which we've created. And that's what brings me to this youth bulge theory, which I will have to touch on. So I do a lot of my academic work is in securitization, and I'm sure many people here have heard of securitization, but securitization is a theory that the elite determine what is an existential threat to the community. And we see it play out with global health, we see it play out with extremism, we see it play out with very many things, where something is afforded more priority and actually allocated more resources to the detriment of other issues in society, which have actually led to that problem. And so a lot of this is cited under, youth bulge is a securitization trigger. People say, well, there's so many youth, and if we don't give them something to do, they're going to kill us all. I mean, and the problem with that is it's completely theoretically unfounded. By empirical evidence, it's not the problem. The problem is actually something called relative deprivation, which is where if I see that you have more and better than me, even though I have worked as hard and I deserve as much, of course, it's going to create resentment. Of course, that's human nature. It's going to create resentment. And if I think that I am not being given because of my gender or my ethnicity or my race or superficial features which have been socially constructed, of course I'm going to fight against those structures, right? I mean, it's a very human concept. It's not about the number of youth, because if we were all actively employed and given the same opportunities and gotten to sit in the same parliaments and get to head up states, I mean, I think we would be a lot less concerned about us picking up guns. So the issue with youth bulge and the framework, the resolution being one of those resulting arms, is that a lot of them are built on this basis that youth are something we should be afraid of. A lot of them are built to counteract this, notion that youth are dangerous. We have to have a resolution to include them in peacebuilding, because if we don't, they might do something. And the problem therein is that we're not actually addressing any of the underlying issues. We don't end up talking about education. We don't talk about the legitimate concerns that youth have. We don't talk about employment. We don't talk about the fact that if we want youth to be included, we have to institutionalize their roles and their voices and their experiences, and they have to be given the same credibility and leverage and opportunity as those who are older. We don't talk about many of those things because we securitize it and we focus it on something as very superficial as countering violent extremism alone, as though you can address that without addressing all the underlying things which underpin it. And that's impossible. It's impossible. So youth and peace building, I think, it's society building, really. We need to be talking about youth's inclusion in every space. We need to be talking about youth's inclusion in education, in media, in infrastructure. We need to be talking about youth everywhere, because the idea that we can somehow isolate it to one specific avenue is I think, very superficial and an oversimplification of our situation. The last thing I'll mention is the parallels between 1325, because I think it's important for us to recognize the challenges that may exist. And if it's already been done once, we know they exist. But I think the largest challenge is that it remains a piece of paper. And a resolution alone has its strengths. obviously, if a resolution is founded in legitimate needs for a community, because Resolution 1325 was a paper I was able to use to get into meetings that I never would have been able to get otherwise with heads of state. So it was definitely key in the sense that it opened up a door. I could say, listen, you got to listen to me. You guys have signed on to this. But that was about it. That was it. There was no political support. There was no financial allocation. A lot of the member states that were in Libya, a lot of the international community had no idea what 1325 was, or if they did, they knew it in passing. But even they did not have enough knowledge for us to be able to actually translate it into some action on the ground. It took a lot of time and education, and we had to educate ourselves, the local civil society in many ways, around it. So for the kind of challenges that may arise, I think that's actually the greatest one, is it can be a piece of paper, but a lot of piece of papers come out of the UN that mean absolutely nothing to people on the ground. And it has to translate in a way which it does not rob people of their local dignity. It has them at the table for their experiences and the value they bring, not because we're worried they might pick up a gun. Thank you.
So, Ala, I'm going to ask you to reflect back, perhaps to a couple of years ago when you were 21 years old, when you started this Voice of Libyan Women, and think about where you are now in your career and the work that you have done in this movement and in advancing this forward, and the space that you occupy now. What do you know now that you wish you knew when you were 21 years old that would have helped you push this ahead even faster? What do you know now that you wish you knew back then that you said, gosh, that would have really propelled us forward?
I would impress my grandpa if I said that I should keep some of my opinions to myself, but I still would never do it. So that would be a falsehood. You know, I think if I reflect back on when I was 21, I actually think maybe I knew a lot more then. I think I knew more then about, so when we started the organization, we were exceptionally collaborative. And I hate to say it, but my ego took a chip sometimes because some people would say, you know, we have to, like, we're not going to meet just with a group of women. So we made sure we had men on our working with us, and we made sure we had people from different regions. And when we did our Noor campaign, which was the largest campaign in Libya, we made sure that we had local city teams. So it wasn't me going to every city. Local city teams created their own logos and their own names. And so there was local ownership, and people were getting educated by people who had taught them and raised them. And so I think I actually probably knew a lot more then about organic and authentic local leadership. And I think I knew a lot more then about how to respond to issues before they really are take hold in the international kind of attention space. So, I mean, we were working on issues of education and things before anybody started talking about countering violent extremism. And then suddenly everybody's like, oh, but that's what you guys are doing. And we're like, no, we're building a country. That's what we're doing. And I think if you look at any empirical evidence shows that if you look at any country in the world, you can tell the level of violence in that country or potential violence based on the negation of women's rights. And so for us, there were things that we had said to the international community in 2012 about it being more difficult to drive at night or some schools being segregated that people didn't pick up on until 2014, 2015. So I think we knew a lot more then. And if I could take anything I know now, it sounds bad, but it would maybe be, I have a lot more knowledge about how to get people into a room, like which words to use in people's emails that like it lights up their Google search alert. So that's probably what I would bring to the time to tell people it's a security crisis and they'd all come running. Yeah. So maybe that's what I would have done differently. I don't know, scare them into the room. I don't know. Yeah.
Sort of different strategies, sort of learning those strategies over time. Well, thank you. So, Natalia, we'll come to you next. So, Dr. Natalia Kanum is the Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund. She has more than 25 years of strategic leadership and experience in the fields of medicine, public and reproductive health, peace, social justice, and philanthropy. I think many of us also know her from her time at the Ford Foundation. We were chatting earlier, and she said to me, Roger Mark, I was there forever. So she was at the Ford Foundation from 1992 to 2005, and she helped pioneer work in women's reproductive health and sexuality, in particular through her position as the Foundation's representative for West Africa. So Natalia, I know that you have some images to show us. One of the things that I am particularly interested in hearing from you and hearing your perspective on is why UNFPA in this space? Why is UNFPA present in this space? Why is this a priority? And what does this mean for you and your portfolio?
Thank you so much, Roger Mark. I am delighted. I'm delighted to be here representing the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, and I'm delighted to also be a member of this very distinguished panel and learning so much from what's been said already, and looking forward also to President Joyce Banda's remarks. I am also happy to be back in Washington. I have been serving UNFPA in Tanzania, and just a month ago took up the new role as Deputy Executive Director. So I'm glad to be here and to have old friends like Michelle and Ka. Todd is here, and also to be actively trying to learn the perspectives of the partners and stakeholders that work alongside UNFPA on the mandate that's represented by the Conference on Population and Development, and some of you are also here. I'm very delighted. Before answering your question, I'd also like to say that, as I've acknowledged, I'm new to this role, and my teammates are here. Benoit is a co-convener with Roger Mark, and we also have from our Washington Partnerships Office, Sarah and Rachel, and then Dawn has come down from my team in New York, and we're trying to personify active partnership also by including the young people with whom UNFPA works by fiat through the United Nations in every aspect of what we're doing. And so we have to learn how to collaborate and to have, as has been stated, real participation and real decision-making in our workings as well. So the Wilson Center has challenged us, what did you say, Roger Mark? Perceptions, connections, questions, and opportunities. And I just want to share a little bit of that. First, to announce that in my opinion, I am excited because of the paradigm shift. There is an opening up underway. I think it remains to us to make sure that it is a genuine opening to build peace, for young people to be activist in strengthening security. And I think it's an enriching day that is bringing us closer to understanding just how complex that's going to be, so that the words do turn into action. Security Council Resolution 2250 is giving me the courage and the resolve to make this youth peace stick. And for the United Nations Population Fund, we know that young people's leadership in preventing and resolving conflict, violence, and extremism, that leadership is an essential resource. It is a route to achieving a sustainable peace. And their participation, moreover, is part of their human rights to promote civic engagement and active participation. Now, when the United Nations Secretary General, and in fact the Security Council's unanimous resolution, as we've heard, highlighted this 2250 resolution, a prior report on peace building in 2012 contained these words, quote, "A successful peace building process must be transformative and create space for a wider set of actors, including, but not limited to, representatives of women, victims, and marginalized communities, and young people," end quote. And these are young people like some of the faces I wanted to allude to today and that inspired part of my remarks. 16-year-old Samar, who lives in a camp for displaced persons in Al Zahra in Yemen. And she is haunted by the night their camp was bombed. Her older brother died immediately. And this is her second time in a camp. While living in the first camp, she was married twice before she was 16 years old. And next, there's a young entrepreneur, Qaid Karim, who runs his games business on the streets. And as you see there, he's talking about the future that he wants for Yemen, echoing safety and prosperity, as Andy spoke of. I hope there will be special attention given to youth and their projects so that we could fulfill our dreams. And the hopes and dreams of these young people who are caught up in a humanitarian crisis, obviously not of their making, are the same hopes and dreams and aspirations as any young person anywhere. They are, in fact, stakeholders. They can be change agents. And I think we're seeing the type of innovation that Dr. Allah alluded to in her remarks. And I actually fervently believe that their lived experiences are part of our shared learning on this peace-building proposition. How can we have peaceful communities? How can we support a democratic governance process? How can we support the transition from what they're facing to what should come next? Youth participation does need to be the rule rather than the exception. And I think that Resolution 2250 at least gives us a platform to demand that this be more systematically embedded in global agendas, in resolutions and agreements. From the Sendai framework that you had on disaster risk reduction, to the Paris Agreement on climate change, and certainly to the Agenda 2030 on sustainable development, of which my personal favorite, number 16, speaks to peace, justice, and strong institutions, and weaves the concerns of young people throughout all of them. I think, again, you made the point more eloquently than I will. You can't isolate one aspect of a young person's experience. I am hungry. Therefore, how am I supposed to learn? Therefore, how am I supposed to take my seat at the table and contribute rather than just being like a, token person sitting there? So I think while there are a lot of them compared to the Millennium Development Goals, the point is that these 17 sustainable goals, whether it's water, whether it's life under the sea, whether it's climate change, et cetera, all have to work together, and peace and partnerships is among these goals. And I think it's also notable that young people themselves help to build these goals and are helping to build the indicators by which we will judge in the year 2030 whether we have made progress on them or not. And I think it's the goal of UNFPA to continue to be in the forefront of bringing young people to the table in their own right as leaders. And I think we also have to take into consideration their diversity and to bring people who are from the hardest to reach areas into the conversation. As you said, it's not just the capital city person who has a contribution to make. And moreover, leave no one behind is supposed to be the theme in the global goals, excuse me. 2 weeks ago, we had the United Nations 71st General Assembly, and UNFPA worked with key partners, again, some of you are here, to bring together 50 young leaders who are working across sectors. And what these 50 young people wanted to do was to develop a call to action, because they think that their forward-looking objective that they want to present to the member states of the United Nations and to the incoming Secretary General, news that we had yesterday, the proposition to establish a UN Commission on Adolescence. This commission would focus political attention and also strengthen accountability vis-a-vis investments in adolescence, thereby having some teeth, again, for the words to turn into action. UNFPA, and we work in over 150 countries, is united and focused on youth empowerment. We do want to support young people's leadership, and I want to allude to their leadership in humanitarian situations, because that's the far outlier end of peace and security. And I think that those young people deserve investment, not just because it's the right thing to do, which it is, but also because it's such a high return investment. Now, other reasons why I'm personally excited, I think the creativity of young people. For me, this resolution heralds an invitation to them to come into the circle and build the peace and security agenda that's going to recognize and prioritize the rights and participation and leadership of everyone for our common future, including them as young people. In collaboration with the Peacebuilding Support Office, UNFPA is leading the development of a progress study. It's a progress study on youth peace and security, because we also think that there's a role for data and measuring what is going on. This study is going to provide evidence of the impact of young people's engagement in conflict prevention and resolution. It will also look at the prevention of violent extremism and will define the future of this agenda, and many of the questions that we discuss here today are to be addressed. And we are confident that the study will produce valuable recommendations, and we will need and we will value your support to make sure that that the study itself is better known, and also that when it's time to implement the recommendations, you will be part of that dynamic. The Youth Peace and Security Agenda does follow in the wake of 1325, which was also alluded to, which was the one on women, peace, and security. And that started to change the rules, and now we have young people also starting to change the rules of how we engage. And I think that we should be clear that it is not about developing specific projects so that young people can go over there and be beneficiaries. It is not a sub-theme. It's not a sub-area of peace building. The mission is rather about opening up the doors of peace and security building to youth actors who have traditionally been excluded and unrecognized. And the point was made earlier by Dr. Allah that young women, in particular, do tend to get left out. So we have to value and build on diversity, this idealism, this creative energy that young people embody. They are much more sensitive to these dynamics of diversity, whether gender, culture, religion, ethnicity, disability, whatever it is, class, sexual orientation, and differential education, because the sad truth is that access to education is still not universal. So whoever they are, these young people's ownership has to be enabled. And I think the accountability for them to each other, but also for us to them, has to be elucidated, has to be measured, and has to be accounted for. And that's why I refer to these Sustainable Development Goals, because those criteria need to be defined, and those indicators are being written this year and the next. I think if we can help to enhance young people's competency, and we had some good examples over the lunch panel, we've heard some here this afternoon as well, these intergenerational partnerships are beyond solidarity. It's actually problem solving and using the best talent so that we can get to the best results, and hopefully in a shorter space of time than it's taken up until now. So I do believe that policies that address the full needs of young people are vital to the peace dividend. And Harris, who is one of the fantastic young people of Trust Africa I just got reacquainted with here today, reminded me that ethics also has to play a part in this discussion. So in closing, I want to say that hope in times of crisis was the theme or the sub-theme of what I've tried to say, because I think real lives are actually at stake. And yes, I dwell in a bureaucracy, but it really is my fervent hope that among warring parties, okay, maybe the answer to peace does not lie there, but it may dwell in the hearts and the hopes of these young people and young men and women all over the world who want to live in peace with their friends and their family and their community. So lastly, I'd like to witness Mona Abdullah, who recently graduated with a business management degree. And her quote, "My dream is one day to enter Parliament and be a decision maker so that I can highlight the importance of women's political participation," kind of summarizes, in my mind, why UNFPA is excited about this possibility that the resolution calls forth. And whether it's Yemen or Syria or northern Nigeria or wherever it is imperative that as governments, as civil society, and as the United Nations, we work in tandem with youth to create a situation where they are engaged and make that real so that they can influence decision-making and help address all of the challenges that we face in the world today, and together help us to build a better future, to shift the paradigm from words into action. I hope I've answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I think that progress study is going to be very exciting. I think very, very practical and helpful. I'm quite struck by a few things you said at the very end. So bear with me. You said you dwell in a bureaucracy. And you mentioned, you talk about your positioning in this bureaucracy, yet this world of possibility that's out there. And you mentioned the importance of governments, civil society, and the UN working with youth. Not the same question that I asked Ala, but a slightly different one. You have a lot of experience in the world of philanthropy. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit as you look at this agenda, what could potentially the role of philanthropy with the UN, with government, civil society, how do you see philanthropy playing a transformative role? I mean, you were there forever. So tell us a little bit about some of your reflections in that space. Where do you see some unique opportunities?
Thank you. And I would also like to reference that President Joyce, who was a founding board member of the African Women's Development Fund, may also have some words on the role of philanthropy. First of all, I would like to say that bureaucracy is really important. It should be fair and it should be efficient, but it's actually like the summation of, in this particular case, the wishes of our member states. And I think the generosity of the member states and the declaration that we, the peoples, are trying to build peace and security is far better than money in terms of a unifying force, because philanthropy really should not be just about the coins of the realm, if you will. Although money is important, if you don't have a united purpose, then how far can you go? So I see the role of philanthropy, and I actually would include the private sector, including just business in this, in entrenching some of these ideas and normalizing the idea that young people have valuable opinions and leadership roles. So when you see how clever some of these new tech companies and what have you not, the average age from Xerox to what we have now has actually dropped by at least a couple of decades. And I think young people always had potential all along, but now there are platforms where technology and perhaps, again, the opening of doors is making this more vigorous. I also see philanthropy, and here you, Roger Mark, represent the convening role. You need dialogue because people don't obviously all agree, at least not all the time, on the same things. And I think philanthropy can play a very strong role in this arena by allowing parties who don't agree to at least be able to come and express the whys and the wherefores. And then lastly, I think that the selflessness and the altruism that philanthropy should represent is also very natural and normal to young people who are accustomed to helping each other. And I think, again, we have a fantastic example right here of someone who wanted to serve. So I think there is a call to service that young people feel, and either it gets nurtured or it gets squelched. Now look at what Allah just said. If she had been rejected and kind of belittled by these people, maybe she would have just walked out the door and shrugged and said, let me move on.
She says,
But exactly, her resolve came from somewhere, and she was 21 years old at the time. So I think the more that we can appreciate that young people have ideas, that they are determined, that they know, quote unquote, right from wrong. And as was said over lunch, maybe some are determined to walk down the wrong path. Okay, fine. But I would bet that the preponderance of young people are actually on the peace side of the equation. But how do they get to express that? You know, who is welcoming them to that dynamic? So philanthropy can just be giving to your neighbor very simply. And again, I've been so touched by examples of people who are living in very squalid situations, you know, literally ran for their lives. And yet and still they're organizing and trying to figure out how they can make a community in these, you know, very challenging physical circumstances. But I think that is the beauty of the human spirit, and that young people truly embody that. Thank you.
thank you. So it's my distinct pleasure to move now to Dr. Joyce Banda. Dr. Banda is the former president of Malawi and a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. We love having you here. What an honor and what a pleasure. Many of you know Dr. Banda quite well. She's an entrepreneur, an activist, a politician, and a philanthropist. She was Malawi's first female president and Africa's second. She's a champion for the rights of women, children, the disabled, and other marginalized groups, and sits on a number of international organization bodies, such as the Scientific Advisory Board for the Program in Global Health and Social Change at Harvard Medical School. Before becoming the president of Malawi, she served as a member of parliament, Minister of Gender and Child Welfare, and Foreign Minister and Vice President of Malawi. While serving as Minister of Gender and Child Welfare, she championed the enactment of a bill on the prevention of domestic violence in 2006, which provides a legal framework for the elimination and prevention of all forms of violence against women and girls. And she also has established the Joyce Banda Foundation International. So one of the things in talking about today's session with President Banda, I wanted her to go first. And this is one of the things that I love about you. She said to me, no, I want to go last because I want to listen first. And I just thought, yes. and then she said to me, but you know, Roger Mark, I'm very often not politically correct. So I said, perfect. This is exactly why we are so delighted to have you here and to have you on this panel. So Dr. Banda, I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on what you have been hearing and to give your thoughts and perspectives on where we are on these issues.
The question that you gave me earlier, you said you'd ask me to talk about what is it that leaders, having been a president, can do to ensure that the youth are participating fully in peace building. So, but first let me take this opportunity to thank you for inviting me, but also to thank the other distinguished panelists, and I'll say why, especially being at this podium with UNFPA and USAID. I would like to refer to what Allah said. Sometimes it's when you're not taken seriously that you can give up. I want to agree with you. But sometimes, so you need organizations, you need partners that will see the potential in you and support you and hold you by the hand. And especially in Africa where you don't have resources. So you may not want to give up, but you are forced to give up in other circumstances. In my case, I went to USAID. I have been fortunate that the issues that I have pushed and championed in my life have emerged from personal experience. I was in an abusive marriage for 10 years. I walked out and made a decision. I will never stand by and watch another woman be abused, if I can help it. Number two, I went to school in a matrilineal system of marriage where your grandmother has to bring you up. My father refused because he was working in town. He says, I want to send my child to school in town. And then they compromised. My grandmother said, well, then she must send her every Friday here without fail, so I can also teach her how to be a wife, an African woman. So every Friday my father gave me 1 shilling and 6 pence to go home. I had a friend in the village by the name of Chris. Without fail, Chris would be waiting by the roadside for me every Friday. We walked into the village. She taught me all about village life. Chris went to the village school, I went to the urban school. Chris was brighter than me. We were both selected to the best girls' secondary school after primary. She went 1 term and couldn't go again because the family couldn't raise $6 for her to go. And I went. And I ended up all the way to State House. And that's the first time I got face to face with the injustice that girls around the world are facing. Right now, 66 million children are not going to school. 56% of those are girls. And I made up my mind that when I grow up, I shall build schools. I shall send as many girls as possible to school. Right now, I'm sending 3,500 girls to school. I went to have my baby at age 34, 1984, and suffered what they call postpartum hemorrhage. I was bleeding to death. In Africa, particularly in Malawi, that's the leading cause of death, pregnant women. But my husband had a friend who was a gynecologist, went and got him and saved my life. And I woke up and started asking questions. What is going on? What is happening to those women that are giving birth in villages at the traditional birth attendants? Why should women die giving life? Why is it that here in America, when you are pregnant, it's a time of joy, expectation, you start shopping, you even know the sex of the child. In Africa, it's a time of anxiety because you don't know that when this girl goes, she's going to come back. And I decided that I was going to spend my life fighting. So it's been education, violence against women, and health. The reason why I said I want to recognize USAID and the UNFPA is because the first time I woke up and decided I was going to do something about the situation, which is the situation with many African women that would want to do, but they don't know how to do it without resources, without being taken seriously, with the dictatorships that will threaten them and their lives. I went to USAID. The country director then in Malawi was Carol Peasley. I said, help me. I just want to build, I don't want you to do it for me. Just give me the capacity, just help me build the capacity to do it. They helped me with institutional capacity in Malawi. That time, USAID was implementing a project they called the Shared Project, where small village groups, village organizations, CBOs, civil society organizations could go to apply for resources to continue with their work and activism. And all that I have achieved started from that one meeting with Carol Peasley. And then the government became so uncomfortable in Malawi, they didn't want to see me. So when we were going to Beijing 1995, which was the time I just didn't see how I could not go to Beijing, they canceled my name. I was talking too much. I'm not politically correct. I went to UNFPA in Malawi. I said my name has been canceled, but I have to go to Beijing. They wrote a letter to Malawi government to say, if Joyce Banda's name is on the list, we shall sponsor 12 women. That's how I ended up in Beijing, when Nafis Sadiq was the executive director. And when Mariangelic Sevani was head of Africa region. I am saying this to draw your attention to the fact that African women are not just men and women are not just sitting back. Youth of Africa are not just sitting back waiting for handouts. They are ready and they know what to do, but what they want is to forge smart partnerships. So now back to my question. Because of my history, because of the fact that for 30 years I've been working in the civil society, trying to change the situation of people's lives, I went into politics and didn't know how to do it. Failed miserably. Why? Because there are so many things you shouldn't do. You have to protect your power. You have to stay in power. You have to protect your votes. You have to have a lot of money. I went the opposite direction. I get there and I say, this is wrong, I'll do it right. I think this is no, madam, this is how we do it, leave it there. No, but it's wrong. Yes, it's okay. I am advocating for political will of leaders if we are going to have our youth involved in peace building. I say this because in the same African continent where I can speak with authority about Africa, in Africa in the 50s, when they were fighting for self-rule, it was young people. The Kwame Nkrumahs were in their 20s and 30s. So even in Malawi, the whole cabinet, there was only one 50-year-old. The rest of them, my husband was Attorney General and Minister of Justice at 27. Today, the average age of African leaders is 62. And the average age of the young people who are the majority is 24. But when now listen to them when they speak, they say, oh, you are leaders of the future. So, I mean, these are 30-year-olds you are talking to. You were a minister at 24, and you still are there. And you are telling a 30-year-old to wait for what? African leaders need to have the political will to engage the youth, or we are going to have the problems that we are facing in Africa forever. The youth are leaders of today, and they are ready today. And when you frustrate them, I don't know if we know as African leaders that leadership is being redefined. People are demanding accountability, transparency, good governance, human rights. And if you still are in the old age where you believe that you should hold on to your power and therefore you are going to silence everybody, then leadership is emerging from the marketplace. That is why we are here talking about the Arab Spring. Because we don't want to listen to the youth, we don't want to engage them. It will be nothing about them without them. They must be engaged, they must be sitting at the table with us. Second, is for us, now I'm, as a woman, leader, to ensure that leaders on the continent pass laws that protect young women. Protect young women against early marriage, protect young women against domestic violence, and protect young women. I say this because when I was president, I established what I called the one-stop destination where abused women could go to report any abuse. I went there to launch that and found this young woman who was a young youth, because she was, I think, less than 25, with a child, 18-month-old, with a man, and I thought they had fought and they were coming to report or for mediation. The man said, I'm not her husband, I am a neighbor. I heard this child cry from 1 year ago, which means that child was 8 months old, and one day I broke the door and found him, the husband of this woman, sleeping with this child. Because somebody had told him that if you sleep with a child, you will be cleansed of the HIV virus. Now I looked at the mother and said, now what was happening when this man was defiling your 8 months old child? She said, I have nothing. I have no parents. I have no food. I have no business. Therefore, he is my breadwinner, and I just didn't have any choice. So for me, it is the laws. It is the punishment that we must punish perpetrators. It's the laws that we must pass. Number 3, we must allow, as presidents, as leaders, allow for press freedom. I have discovered during the time I was in leadership that the young people that are free will bring out their best, will flourish, will progress, will succeed. When you close them up that they shouldn't speak, that's when they go and hide by the roadside and begin, and all the conflicts are coming, emerging from there. In Malawi, when I became president, our international place on the index for press freedom, we were at 245, and we were able to improve that to 79. Because I said, just open up, allow people to associate, to speak, and to write what they want. The next is that we must be on the lookout for leaders. I start a controversy everywhere I speak that where leadership is born. I mean, leaders are born, and then people say, no, as scholars, they are not. You can create a leader, you can build a leader, you can develop a leader, but I insist they are born. Leaders are born. Now, but if they are born, that leadership has to be nurtured. That the spirit has to be unleashed for this leadership to come out. What is it, what support are we doing as leaders, as presidents, to make sure that we provide that opportunity for the leadership to come out, for that opportunity? How many of us as presidents appoint young people to our cabinets and to positions of leadership? In my case, my vice president was 36. Because you will be surprised what a loss it is for us leaders to stick to power with our fellow 62-year-olds and leave out the youth who can bring up bright, brilliant, young ideas. I want to pay special attention to young women leaders that are doing wonderful things on the continent of Africa, and even here. One small girl that I can cite as an example lives in South Carolina, went to Africa for the first time. She comes from Cameroon. She went to Africa with her mother, saw fellow children going to school without handbags, with their books in plastic papers. Asked her mother, why don't they have shoes or bags? Well, they are poor, they don't have. She came back, and when she went in her class, taught her class, she raised 50 bags. That started her project. Now she runs an organization that distributes school bags to 35 countries on the continent of Africa, and she's 13 years old. Yeah, I can go on and on and on. We have leadership in Africa and all over that just needs us to pay attention and to lift those young people, the youth, into leadership. Young people get encouraged when they see fellow leaders, fellow young people on your cabinet. If there was an issue in Malawi about the youth, I just sent my vice president, who is a fellow youth, to go and talk to them. When he comes back, it's solved. Because they trust that person. They know that you are sincere because you are appointing young people to positions of leadership. Finally, it is corruption. I believe that to create opportunities for the youth, jobs, programs that will keep them busy, you need resources as a continent or as leaders. Not only in Africa, now we know that corruption is a global problem. From the Panama Papers, now we know it's everybody. But what we need to do is to make sure that we are resisting that temptation. We are serving as much as we can. I am mentioning this deliberately because I know it's not easy. It's not easy because in my case, in Malawi, it was the European Union ambassador who alerted me to say, you want to know? I wanted to know. I asked him. He says, check your financial management system. Before you became president, your predecessors, we told them they couldn't listen. And that's how I started to arrest people. It's not easy because when you arrest one person, you are fighting with a very strong person, but that person has thousands of people behind. So you are making all those enemies. You must do that at the expense of votes. So every leader that really wants to serve their people must ensure to include the youth, but must also protect what belongs to them, because if you are truly serving them, you must be prepared to say, there's life beyond State House. Let me lose the election, but let me protect what belongs to the poor. Number two, they smear that back onto you. So in my case, I was lucky. The British government helped me to conduct a forensic audit that protects me even now. So I just want to close with that. To say Resolution 2250 shall just be on paper if there is no political will. Thank you.
Thank you, President Banda. You could hear a pin drop in this room while you were speaking. So I know that you love to also interact with folks who are in the room. So I'd like to open it up now. So my colleagues will come to you. If you have a question or comment for anyone on the panel, please give your name and your affiliation and get quickly to your question so we can take as many of them as possible. So yes, please.
I'm Jane Myers, and I'm from the Lubuto Library Partners. We are building libraries, a model of public libraries that serve children and youth in Africa, starting in Zambia and coming to Malawi soon, we hope. One thing we've learned in working with young people in Zambia is that through focus groups and just for our interaction with them, that for many of them, and particularly for girls, their biggest enemy in getting ahead is actually their parents, and that they help each other, that where they usually turn for help very often, or where help is offered, is young people helping each other. We know young girls who are able to go to school and their friend isn't, the way you were with your friend when you were young, and they would come home from school every night and copy down everything they know to give to their friend. That kind of thing, that it's so striking how much that happens. We were just awarded a PEPFAR Dreams grant to help keep adolescent girls in secondary school, and as part of the USAID's PEPFAR program to fight the rising HIV infection rate among adolescent girls. And one of the things that we are doing under this grant is to start a peer-to-peer mentoring program. We have a number of different kinds of mentoring programs, but we thought peer-to-peer was important. And I just wanted to follow up on this idea of reverse mentoring, and wondering if there is a way that this kind of mentoring can actually make a difference for the adults that are keeping young people down.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, any other questions? Yes, please. If you can use the microphone, thank you.
Howaida Diab for the Embassy of Libya. My questions, how can we guarantee that the 2250 will have and do independent mechanism implementation than 1325? How can we make sure that the 2250 will have the financial resources to grow as 1325? And how can we make sure that the 2250 will have an impact on ground, not only for the elite youth? Thank you.
Great questions. Yes, please, at the back. Yes? Lenny, to the back there. Go ahead. Go ahead, quickly, please.
First of all, thank you very much to Her Excellency and all the distinguished speakers. I'm very honoured to be here. I'm representing the federal government of Somalia. I'm Chief Legal Advisor to the Prime Minister. My question is addressing an issue that I see that's very rampant in Somalia. You have multiple different layers. You've got foreigners coming in from different NGOs and things like that, who are all in green zones. And then you have returning diaspora, such as myself, coming back. And then you have local youth that are trying to make a difference. So my question is, what can the government effectively do to be able to engage and to allow both the diaspora youth and the local level youth to integrate and also to work together, given that there are cultural barriers and language barriers and so forth, without isolating them or alienating them?
Great,
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Abnat Sagai. I'm representing Fenton Communications right now. And the question that I have that Dr. Joyce brought up was that it's important for leaders to be scouting, potential new leaders. So I'm curious in what are some of those qualities and attributions that leaders are looking for?
Great, thank you. I'll repeat the questions. So what are the qualities of leadership that you should be looking out for if you want to foster and nurture leaders? Okay, and one last question, please, up front.
Hello, my name is Kawala from
hold on, she's gonna.
Yes, my name is Kawala from Cameroon, and I want my question is how, in the implementation of this approach, do you take into account the fundamental governance situation in the country? Because I am a little bit afraid of the word peace, coming from a country that 56 years after independence has had two presidents. The current one is 83 years old, and he has been there for 34 years. And the sentence you see most often describing my country is peaceful and stable.
Right.
This is an extremely rich country with every mineral resource you can imagine, with fantastic conditions for agriculture, where 40% of the people live with less than $2 a day. And we are described as peaceful and stable. And Boko Haram has been able, for the last 5 years, to take stronghold in our country because we have youth who do not have an alternative. When I hear young people in building peace and security in this kind of situation, it makes me nervous because I want the young people in my country to be out on the street without violence, but very determined, asking for fundamental change in their governance situation. So if we start involving them in workshops and they start, writing grants to ask for funding to build peace and security, it undermines the fight, the political fight in which I am involved in, which must take place in our country. So I think it is important. This approach is great, but we have to be careful that it doesn't become a stumbling block in countries where we actually need those youth.
Okay, thank you very much. So 5 very small questions for you. How can adults in this space benefit from reverse mentoring? What are the opportunities for implementation, financial support, and impact on the ground of 2250? Thinking of Somalia, but elsewhere, what can the government do to engage diaspora youth and link them to local youth? What are the qualities of leadership that are important that you're looking out for? And how can we engage youth in a way that they're able to address the governance situation that leads to the fundamental changes without undermining the ongoing political fight? So Natalia, is it okay to start with you? And you could address 1 or 2 of those if you'd like.
Well, I have a couple of observations and, appreciated all of the questions. I think this is the dilemma that we're wrestling in, turning a resolution into something that's practicable and that's operationalizable. In terms of political will, that is the fundamental issue around the financing and everything else that goes with it. But the other fundamental issue is for young people to be aware and embrace the fact that they have human rights just like everybody else. So from my perspective, the demand for putting this new commission on adolescence is coming from young people. They're actually even younger than youth. Adolescents are 10 to 19. Youth is up to age 29. And if that's what they want, and if that's what they turn their attention to, then I think it's up to us to be persuaded, and as was said earlier, to try to help them construct something that's viable. For the issue of both harmonizing diaspora youth and the question that Ka put on the table, like, are we trying to build complacency by encouraging young people to engage? Well, I can't speak for, what the member states had in mind. This was a unanimous declaration, and a lot of it had to do with worries about technology, to my reading, and a lot of it does have to do with the intention to quell youth being enticed to violent extremism. Both of these are things which I do see young people in a quest for defining their role in a society. And they need to be given workable, practical practical ways of contributing. So if you're not in a situation where you get up, you go to school, or whatever it is that organizes your life, there is a tendency to organize around X. So I feel if you're in a situation and a young person is cognizant that they are a participant in their community, they are perfectly capable of making an analysis. And I think it's our role, whether you're a parent, and parents can be excellent allies, or whether you are, I think the situation with the libraries where you were describing that some youth perceive adults as being people who are blocking their path, if you will, that kids are making this analysis all the time. So ultimately, I think that they will exercise their judgment. As an institution, we feel that it's important to inform young people, to show them evidence, to protect them. And more than anything, I think this phrase, empower, for them to realize that you're not just a passive person, that you have ideas, that you have agency. So that would be my contribution. I think
Thank you very much. Anna?
So I'm going to start off with how we guarantee that 2250 will work, as well as is it making people more complacent, and diaspora. And I'm going to kind of answer those hopefully all together. The efficiency of youth. Now, so I moved to Libya in 2005. I had been 15 at the time, and I went to university there. I did my medical school there. And so I was painted with two brushes throughout my time there. I've been painted with diaspora and local, because I had been there for now the majority of my life. But I had gone to school there, so people knew me. But when it was convenient for them, I was the foreign girl. And I have learned that there are significant advantages and disadvantages to that. But in an effort to kind of separate that and be able to answer your question, I think the fact that, to be quite frank, diaspora youth have more access, can speak in a language that people can relate to, and can use even common kind of pop culture references that the people around the room feel more comfortable with. And it actually does help. It's a huge door opener. Whereas local youth have more legitimacy and credibility in their local communities, particularly if they are rural communities. And those two are key. If you want something to work on the ground, you need to be able to bring the financing and bring the international support and get your national media, which is a very elite often space where diaspora do still have a bit more influence. You need to be able to get the financial support from them and the media support and the green light. But then on the ground, you need people who can go into schools and who can say, listen, I've been here since I was a baby. I know how the hospital works. I know what this looks like, right? So I think having those two together is phenomenal. What we need to be doing, and I do put a lot of this on the international aid community, to be honest, is we need to dispel this notion that you have to compete for resources. That is our biggest issue. We have a situation where diaspora youth are creating their own organizations and local youth are creating their own, and they end up competing and cutting each other off at the knees. So what we need to be doing is getting everybody to start working together and to create the idea, the notion that in your community, and I'm all for community competition if you want to do that. If you want to say I'm the best to work in this community, then I agree with you. The locals are always the best, but those locals have to be comprised of everybody who's there. So people of different backgrounds, diaspora, young, old, male, female, everybody's got to be part of that organization. And that would be the thing I could say. And I honestly do think that the right of way does go to the local organization. So if you're diaspora and something exists when you get there, then find a way for you to work with it. But don't start creating something else because you don't think they work right for you. To go into does it making youth complacent? So I'm going to join you on the not politically correct train, because my God, I think that's a huge part of it. I think we have to be very, very honest about where this resolution came from, and we have to be very honest about the fact that it came from a recognition from member states that national governments and nation states are no longer the governing force in the world. They're not. Our corporations have more power than our governments do. Non-state actors can entice people quicker than we can. And let's be 100% honest, the communication mechanisms we're all talking about, all these great inventive things where we say youth are the leaders of tomorrow, they're not. They created those. They're the leaders of today, and they're creating a new world that a lot of older people, I think, are worried they will be irrelevant in pretty soon. So I think if we want to be 100% honest, a lot of this does come from some some self-sustenance. We're like, we got to keep it together. Let's try to get them to play our game before they keep creating an arena that we don't know how it works. And I honestly think that's how 2250 works, is you need to keep reminding member states, if you don't do this, you're not going to be able to play ball at all. Because they are going to create a whole new system and you'll be on the sidelines. And I do think people work in their self-interest. I know it sounds very cynical, I apologize, but I mean, empirically speaking, people do what they think is best for them. And if we remind governments that if you do not work with them this way, they will find another way to work, and they do outnumber you and most of the world, it's important for you to play. The last thing I'll mention is also tied to how we make 2250 work, but it's also in terms of credibility. 2250 has a credibility problem. Like most UN resolutions, it comes built with a built-in credibility problem. And the reason that exists is because we talk about it as though it only applies to certain parts of the world. So it applies to the Yemens and to, the South Sudans, but it doesn't apply to the United States. And you could as easily take Muna off that and put Jessica or Hillary as somebody who wants political influence and power. So this has to be something that applies everywhere. This cannot be something sensationalized and imperialized, saying that only a certain group of people are only effective and important when they are working with us on certain issues, like countering violent extremism. If we want to talk about youth inclusion, then we're talking about giving up a huge chunk of our own power, like a huge chunk, and our own money and our own political stage to others. And if we are actually genuinely prepared to do that, is the only way we're really going to know if 2250 is going to work. And I have my own suspicions that it won't. And the last thing I'll add very quickly on 2250, in conflict zones especially, is we're all giving a lot of lip service to working in conflict spaces and with people who are working in conflict spaces. And yet we then have the UN sitting in, fancy bulletproof cars and compounds where they ask youth to come to them. And then when those youth go back to their local communities, they're accused of being everything from a CIA operative to like somebody who landed on the moon. So I think we have to be very, very realistic of what we're asking and what we're providing. We cannot say we're putting financial resources into youth, peace, and security when it really is just financial resources into countering violent extremism and all that encompasses, without saying we're providing security, political support to the youth who work on the ground, not to our own people who are getting paid 400 euros a day as contractors in that community and who still provide us with negligent information. So I think if we're going to talk about youth, peace, and security, we have to talk about the global security and aid system which goes along with it.
Thank you. Andy?
Thank you. I appreciate the honesty in the discussion. Ahmed Al-Handawi, who's a very good friend, who's a UN Youth Envoy, actually started something where if someone in the room who's speaking says youth are the leaders of tomorrow, he actually walks out of the room and says, okay, I'll come back tomorrow, done. I think it's actually a good way of thinking about this. I want to tackle a couple of the questions, and first the young leader question. And I think this actually also is to Dr. Allah's point too about going into communities that may not necessarily be the elites. President Obama launched a number of young leader initiatives. Some of his really headline young leader initiatives, something called YALI in 2010, the Young African Leaders Initiative, something called YSEALI, Young Southeast Asia Leaders Initiative, the Young Leaders of the Americas Initiative focused on Latin America and the Caribbean, and just recently the Young Transatlantic Innovative Leaders Initiative focused on entrepreneurship and young leaders in Europe and Eurasia. And among these four programs, which are just a snapshot of a host of nearly 50 plus programs focused on young leaders that are exchanges and different leadership development type efforts, we really focus on a variety of people who we think have potential, who are embassies and consulates, partners in the field, and we need to do a better job of identifying folks who are outside of our zones of contact, who really have shown some source of leadership potential, of people who I think my boss, who at the State Department, a guy named Rick Stengel, ghost wrote Long Walk to Freedom with Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela is the godfather of his kids. And he always tells a story about Nelson Mandela telling him that what really defined leaders across generations was first and foremost a willingness to lead, a sense of willing to put in the work, to know the community that you're trying to represent and to lead, to be able to develop the skill sets that you may need, that you may be fearful of actually developing, public speaking being first and foremost, understanding communities that you're trying to represent. but kind of looking for different traits, a willingness to lead, inklings of influence, that these people, we can only affect or connect with so many people on the exchange program at American taxpayers' expense. We want to target people who are going to be real influencers in their communities, who have followings, who are going to be able to mobilize larger networks of people. And we spend a lot of time and effort with partners and embassies and consulates trying to identify who those leaders might be. I also wanted to touch on Kai Walla's point too about challenges in communities where young people maybe are non-violently advocating for some of their basic human rights, and whether or not in parts of the globe right now connecting to a government, whether it be the U.S. or somebody else, the UN, may not necessarily be in their interest. And I think that's a totally valid point. And that's the importance, I think, of many of the folks in this room who are doing that from the NGO standpoint. People like Dr. Allah and others who have organizations on the ground, they're getting their hands dirty. President Banda and others who are empowering women, who are allowing people that space and that comfort level to be able to activate their voice and to mobilize one another. And then just lastly on 2250, I think it never would have honestly happened had it not been for youth leaders, activists, for advocates, for partners, many of whom are in this room, to really mobilize and come together to actually push governments to kind of get this on the UN agenda. And I think for the implementation piece and kind of turning that ink into action, you got to, again, mobilize that same coalition and broaden it out to really include the people who maybe weren't involved in the formation of this resolution to make it count and to make it actually have some real lasting purpose.
Thank you, Andy. President Banda?
Yeah, I've only got to tackle. I would like to hope that I heard the question well about Zambia. Did you say that the parents are not supporting the young people? They are standing in the way? Is it, as far as you're concerned, is it a tradition? Yeah, it must be behavior change that is required, because I say this because that's what I'm writing about at the CDG. I am also a distinguished fellow at the Center for Global Development, and so I'm focusing on parental attitudes to girls' education. But in the same vein, I have come to find out that what we need to tackle first is those attitudes to change, those behavior change first. And that can be easily achieved. And I know because I've tried, because when we speak to people that are not African, they tell us, no, that's huge. We don't even want to tackle that. Well, if we are serious about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, then we must tackle that. And I think that the first step for us is to make sure that we change, mindset shift. The parents must come to understand that times have changed. And I've been reading reports lately about leadership here. And they say that they interviewed women in China, women in UAE, women in Africa, all of them. How did you become a leader? What do you think helped shape you when you were growing up? Each one of them, without fail, talked about the role their father played when they were growing up. And even for me, it was my aha moment, because now I said, oh, I see. Because my father was just this different father who took me even to work. He was a musician. He even took me to the band room, introduced me to music, classical music. Somebody who didn't go to school very much. So in the same vein, that is what needs to happen. What needs to happen is to change here, to make sure that the youth are given space and given an opportunity to participate in leadership, but also to make sure that we are getting rid of these traditional habits and culture that is standing in the way of the youth. And the youth will not understand if there's no this shift of mind on the part of the parents first. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I would like to give an example to say that in a normal situation in a village in Africa, mother and daughters eat on the other side of the house, father and sons on the other side, and it's normal. There's nothing wrong they are doing. That's how it ought to be. Now, if this girl child has leadership in her, and the father plays an important role, like my father played in my role, and this girl child has no chance of speaking to father who is sitting on the other side, then it's a loss to the nation, because this girl will never be a leader. What needs to happen first is to change the system at this household level, where the norm, what appears to be normal now, must change. Parents must sit together. And I am one child who was sitting with my father at a table when the whole village was not sitting, the girls were not sitting with their father. So I don't know if I'm answering the question. What I am saying is that while you're opening libraries, there must be massive civic education. We did that with maternal health in Malawi. We were able to reduce a whole lecture, another one. But we were able to reduce maternal death from 675 to 460 in 2 years in Malawi. And the African Union gave us an award. But we had to change the thinking of the chiefs first, the families first, about pregnancy.
Thank you very much.
The last one was that about leadership. And I think so many people have asked me, what is it that I need to do to become a president as well? And I have, and I have no answer, because I truly believe that because of what you said about Nelson Mandela, in fact, you put words, you stole words from my mouth. No. Yes, because I have always wondered, how do leaders come about? What happens? Yeah. How is it that Nelson Mandela was the head of the youth when Oliver Tambo was head of the party? But this leader of the youth, who was very young, who was a youth, who was Nelson Mandela, said, I'm ready to die. What is it that happens to a person to be prepared to give up your life? It must be, that leadership must be inborn. It must be more than just wanting power. So, yes, so equally, in a situation where you're asking now, how do I become a leader? If you are meant to be a leader, it just develops. You start by being active in your society. Even if children are playing, this one who has leadership in her will be the one who will say, go and get a stone, and why are you going to get a piece of wood? Yes, so, and for us as society, what we do is observe that, capture it, and nurture it. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question. Somebody, yeah.
Very good. Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, President Bondo. I'd like to call on my colleague, Benoit Casala, just to give any final thoughts and reflections. Benoit, on our conversation today, a very rich conversation, and we'd like to have you close us off today, please.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Roger Mark is a friend, but maybe we are going to break the peace because he took the easiest role of moderating this panel. And now he's asking me to give you a summary of 4 sessions, because we started in the morning. So I'm not going to do that, I think, and you understand. But my colleagues have prepared something that we are going to post as concluding remarks. Let me start by recognizing them. I think Francesca, Daniel, Cecile, and Sarah and Roger, they did the all work. So what I would like to do is just to give you my takeaway from this day. This morning, we started by saying that we needed a frank discussion. And I must say that the frank discussion happened. This morning, I can't see Mark. Mark came up, he told us about his book. And if I checked, it is on Amazon. It is about the outcast majority, world development, and youth in Africa. It is challenging, and I'm taking that away as a challenge. Your last point on Cameroon, my wife is from Cameroon, so I can understand where you are coming from. it is challenging. You know, you are putting on the table a very difficult question. And for leaders, it is a very difficult question. But it is worth posing as a question. And at lunchtime, there is also the director of the Peace Institute asked that question to the UN, if, as the United Nations, we could use the money that donor countries, member states are giving us, just to invest as a trial, ready to fail, which is also a challenge. But these are something that I'm taking away. But most importantly, I think partnerships. In this room, we have students, we have politicians, we have advocates, we have civil society, we have United Nations. I think we will need this range of partnership to move forward and implement the resolution 2250. I think that is something that we need to take on board. The second area is the paradigm shift that we wanted to see in this conference. And I see few areas where this has already happened, is the way we look to the youth bulge. I think there is a positive way of looking at that, and we need to do that. We need to unpack it, not to just relate that to male young people, but to male and female as parts of the young people, that they are the peace builders developing their countries. And the other thing is we need to look differently to government, their role as duty bearers. I think that is very critical. And the implementation of the laws that Madam President called, you need to have people who understand their role as duty bearers. And there is no one youth population. They are, you say organic. I think that dimension is very important. Now, from here, what we need is how do we keep the momentum, right? I think advocacy should continue. Capacity building on this matter should continue, whatever format we want to adopt. Interagency collaboration, I think that is needed. Now, this social change, the soft skills that are needed, I think we need to work on that to change the attitudes. I think that is also one area that I think is a takeaway for me. And, you know, reflecting on peace building and looking at what my boss displaying the SDGs, I think at that as sustainable development. I think what is more important, we spend a lot of money in fixing systems when they are broken, not preventing. I think this resolution for me, I see it within the demographic dividend, a conversation that we have been having in this room and the other rooms of the Wilson Center, in terms of how do we educate, how do we employ, how do we empower young people so that they are the peace builder that we have been calling out. I think for me, that is the framework. And if we take that framework, all the partnership we need, they will come. We need a gender revolution. We need education revolution. We need that transformation of many norms, many systems, including the way we look at employment, where the entrepreneurship that Andy just mentioned. I think today, young people, they are creating their own jobs. And then I think let them create their own society. So they are not the future. They are making the future. They are shaping the future. I think that's the way, from my position today, that's the advice I will bring back to the organization, to UNFPA, to say, if we want to define a role of the United Nations Population Fund on young people, it is how do we develop and empower young people. I think for me, that is the way forward. So this is my takeaway. And I continue to cherish our friendship, our partnership with the Wilson Center, but next time I will choose to moderate and we are going to conclude. So thank you very much to all, and then looking forward for next forum.
Thank you, Benoit. That was excellent. So once again, this has been video recorded. It will be video archived. You can come back to it, and we will write a summary of the discussion that will be on our blog platform, New Security Beat. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you again to the panel for excellent discussion. Thank you.